In a corner of an Arizona rehab center, a young bobcat waited, alone, unwanted, and just days from being euthanized. His name was Ranger, and if no one intervened, he would be euthanized in less than 48 hours. His fate seemed sealed, until one woman showed up. Veteran wildlife rehabilitator Sarah Mitchell stood outside the quarantine pen, her hands pressed against the cold railing. "He's the last one," a keeper said softly beside her. "We've found homes for all the others, but there's just no one left to take him." She kept her gaze on the animal, the slow rhythm of his breathing, the faint tremor in his flank. What she saw in Ranger wasn't just a wild animal. She saw a life worth saving. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The quarantine pen at the Arizona Wildlife Rehabilitation Center stretched 12 feet by 20, its chain link walls topped with an overhang to prevent escape. Inside, pressed against the farthest corner, a young bobcat watched the world through amber eyes that held equal parts fear and defiance. His spotted coat, which should have gleamed with health in the desert sun, appeared dull and patchy. The prominent ridge of his spine and the visible outline of his ribs told a story of neglect that went back months, maybe longer. Sarah Mitchell stood outside the enclosure, her weathered hands gripping the clipboard that held the animal's fate. 23 years of wildlife rehabilitation had taught her to read the signs. The slight tremor in the bobcat's haunches, the defensive curl of his body, the way his breathing quickened whenever someone approached. This wasn't just fear. It was learned helplessness, the kind that came from prolonged captivity in inadequate conditions. "His name's Ranger," said Tom Henderson, the facility director, stepping up beside her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert compound, and somewhere in the distance, a red-tailed hawk called out from its flight pen. "Came from that exotic animal facility that got shut down outside Flagstaff. You heard about it?" Sarah nodded. Everyone in the wildlife rehabilitation community knew about the Desert Winds Exotic Animal Park. What had started as Robert Carson's dream of creating an educational facility had devolved into a nightmare of overcrowding and neglect. The state had finally intervened after an undercover investigation revealed animals living in squalor. Big cats in cages barely large enough to turn around in, primates without proper shelter, and native species like Ranger kept illegally without permits. "The court order came through yesterday," Tom continued, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had to say. "All the other animals from the seizure have been placed. The 2 mountain lions went to the sanctuary in Colorado. The serval's heading to an accredited facility in Texas. Even found spots for the foxes." He paused, looking at the clipboard in Sarah's hands. "But Ranger, we've called everyone. No facility has space for another bobcat. The judge gave us 72 hours to find placement or..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah watched as Ranger shifted position slightly, his tufted ears swiveling to track their voices. Bobcats were solitary by nature, but this one had been kept in a small enclosure adjacent to larger predators for over 2 years. The constant stress had left him reactive and unpredictable. 3 different facilities had already assessed him and declined to take him, citing behavioral concerns and lack of appropriate housing. "When's the deadline?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the paperwork. "Thursday morning, 8 a.m. Tom rubbed his face, exhaustion evident in every line. The facility had been overwhelmed with the sudden influx of animals from the seizure. "Sarah, I've been doing this for 15 years and I've never had to..." "We save them. That's what we do. But the county's breathing down my neck, and if we can't place him..." The unspoken hung between them like the desert heat, already oppressive despite the early hour. Euthanasia. A healthy 2-year-old bobcat would be put down not because he was sick or suffering, but because the system had no place for him. Sarah thought about her own facility 30 miles south, tucked into the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. She had space, technically. The enclosure that had housed a rehabilitated bobcat released last spring still stood empty. But taking on a bobcat with Ranger's background meant months, maybe years, of intensive work. It meant additional permits, increased insurance costs, and daily interaction with an animal that might never fully trust humans again. "Let me make some calls," she said finally, knowing even as the words left her mouth that she was stalling. Tom's expression told her he knew it too. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, phone beside her, a cup of coffee growing cold as she worked through her contact list. She called colleagues in New Mexico, Nevada, California. The responses were variations on a theme. "We'd love to help, but too full. Not equipped for behavioral cases. Insurance wouldn't cover it. Budget constraints." Martha Rodriguez at the Sonoran Wildlife Center listened patiently before sighing. "Sarah, you know I'd take him if I could. But we just took in 3 bobcats from that hoarding case in Phoenix. I'm already over capacity." By midnight, Sarah had exhausted her list. She stood on her back porch, looking out over the desert landscape bathed in moonlight. Somewhere out there, wild bobcats moved through the shadows, hunting pack rats and rabbits, marking territory, living the lives they were meant to live. Ranger would never have that freedom. Born in captivity, sold illegally as a cub to someone who thought a wild cat would make an interesting pet, then confiscated and placed at Carson's facility when he became too much to handle. His entire life had been a series of human failures. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the rehabilitation center before dawn. The overnight keeper, a young woman named Jessica, was just finishing her rounds. "How was he during the night?" Sarah asked, nodding toward Ranger's enclosure. "Paced for about 2 hours after lights out," Jessica reported, consulting her notes. "Ate about half his food. Vocalized a few times. That low growl they do when they're stressed." She hesitated. "Ms. Mitchell, is it true? About Thursday?" Sarah didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "I'm going to spend some time with him today. Can you handle the morning feeds for the other animals?" For the next 6 hours, Sarah simply observed. She positioned herself about 15 feet from Ranger's enclosure, far enough not to be threatening, close enough to establish presence. She didn't try to interact, didn't speak, just sat quietly with a notebook, documenting his behavior. Ranger initially retreated to his corner, body tense, eyes never leaving her. But as the hours passed and she remained still, his posture gradually relaxed. By noon, he had moved to the center of his enclosure, stretching out in a patch of sunlight. When she finally stood to leave, he watched her go with curiosity rather than fear. That afternoon, Sarah found Tom in his office, surrounded by paperwork from the seizure. "I'll take him," she said without preamble. Tom looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Sarah, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She sat down across from him. "I've got the empty enclosure. My USDA and state permits are current. I can modify them to include a permanent resident." "He's not a release candidate," Tom warned. "He'll never be wild. This is a lifetime commitment." "I know." Sarah had thought about this all morning while watching Ranger. but lifetime in captivity is still lifetime. He deserves that chance. Tom leaned back in his chair, relief and concern warring on his face. The insurance alone. I'll figure it out. Sarah was already making mental calculations. She could increase her education program bookings, apply for additional grants. What do I need to sign? The transfer happened 2 days later, just 18 hours before the deadline. Sarah had spent the intervening time preparing, reinforcing the enclosure fencing, adding hiding spots and elevated platforms, creating visual barriers so Ranger could choose when to be seen. She'd also called in favors, arranging for Dr. Emily Patterson, the veterinarian who specialized in wild cats, to be on standby. The transport went more smoothly than expected. Ranger, sedated for the journey, was placed in a specially designed transfer crate. During the 30-mile drive, Sarah kept the radio off, windows cracked for fresh air, maintaining a steady speed to minimize stress. When they arrived at Sarah's facility, the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Sarah and her assistant, Marcus, carefully positioned the crate at the entrance to the prepared enclosure. As the sedation wore off, Ranger emerged slowly, cautiously, his pupils dilated as he took in his new surroundings. For the first week, Sarah maintained the same routine she'd established at the rehabilitation center, simply sitting near the enclosure for hours each day, reading paperwork, eating lunch, existing in his space without demands or expectations. Ranger remained wary but watched her with increasing interest. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on day 10. Sarah had brought her lunch to eat near the enclosure as usual when she dropped her apple. It rolled toward the fence, stopping just outside. Without thinking, she reached for it, her movement quick and natural. Ranger, who had been resting on his platform, immediately tensed. But instead of retreating, he did something remarkable. He approached the fence, sniffing curiously at the apple. Sarah froze, hardly daring to breathe. Slowly, carefully, she rolled the apple under the fence. Ranger sniffed it, then, to her amazement, began to play with it, batting it around his enclosure like an oversized toy. It was the first playful behavior anyone had documented since his confiscation. Over the following months, progress came in small increments. Ranger began anticipating Sarah's arrival, often waiting by the fence when he heard her truck. He started eating his full portions, gained weight, and his coat regained its healthy sheen. He still didn't like sudden movements or loud noises, but he no longer cowered when staff performed routine maintenance. The real test came when Sarah decided to introduce enrichment training. Using positive reinforcement techniques she'd learned from colleagues who worked with zoo animals, she began teaching Ranger simple behaviors, targeting a stick with his nose, moving to different parts of his enclosure on cue, allowing visual inspection of his paws and teeth. Each successful interaction was rewarded with his favorite treat, quail. Dr. Patterson, observing one of these sessions 6 months after Ranger's arrival, shook her head in amazement. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. When I examined him at the seizure, he was completely shut down. Now look at him. Ranger was indeed transformed. Though he would never be the relaxed, social animal that some captive-born bobcats became, he had found his confidence. He used every inch of his enclosure, climbing the platform Sarah had installed, lounging in the artificial cave she'd created, playing with the various toys and puzzles that provided mental stimulation. A year after his arrival, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She applied for Ranger to become an education ambassador. Not for public programs, he would never be comfortable with crowds, but for small, controlled sessions with wildlife biology students from the nearby university. The first session was carefully orchestrated. 3 students, all seniors in the wildlife management program, sat quietly outside Ranger's enclosure while Sarah explained his history. Ranger, curious about the new faces, actually approached the fence, allowing the students to observe his distinctive features up close. The black bars on his forelegs, the white spots behind his ears that cubs use to follow their mothers through tall grass. "Every animal has a story," Sarah told them. Ranger's story is one of survival against human failure. He represents thousands of wild animals trapped in the exotic pet trade, sold to people who don't understand their needs, confiscated and shuffled through a system ill-equipped to handle them. One student, a young woman named Rebecca, stayed after the others left. "Ms. Mitchell, what would have happened if you hadn't taken him?" Sarah watched Ranger climb to his favorite platform, settling in for his afternoon nap. He would have been another statistic. A healthy animal euthanized not because we wanted to, but because we failed to plan for the consequences of human greed and ignorance. 2 years passed. Ranger became a fixture at Sarah's facility, known to the regular volunteers and university students who visited. He never became tame. Sarah would never describe him that way. But he became content. He had routine, enrichment, proper nutrition, and most importantly, choice. He could choose when to interact, when to hide, when to play, when to rest. The day everything changed started like any other. Sarah was preparing Ranger's morning meal when her phone rang. It was Martha Rodriguez from the Sonoran Wildlife Center. "Sarah, I have an unusual situation. We just received a young female bobcat from a failed reintroduction attempt. She's captive-born, can't be released, but she's social with other bobcats. I know Ranger has been alone, but I wondered, would you consider attempting a careful introduction?" Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. Ranger had been solitary for so long, and bobcats were naturally territorial. But something made her pause. She'd noticed changes in Ranger lately. A restlessness, increased vocalizations, wearing paths along his fence line as if searching for something beyond. "Send me her history," Sarah said finally. "Let me think about it." The female, named Luna, arrived 2 weeks later after extensive planning. Sarah had divided Ranger's large enclosure with a temporary fence, allowing visual and olfactory contact without physical interaction. The introduction would be slow, possibly taking months. Ranger's reaction was immediate and surprising. Instead of the aggressive territorial display Sarah expected, he showed intense curiosity. He spent hours by the dividing fence, chirping and purring, vocalizations Sarah had never heard from him before. Luna, younger and more social, responded positively, often lying just on the other side of the fence from him. After 6 weeks of careful observation and graduated contact through the fence, Sarah made the decision to remove the barrier. She and her staff stood ready with water hoses and separation boards, prepared for any sign of aggression. They needn't have worried. Ranger approached Luna slowly, cautiously, but without hostility. They touched noses, then, in a moment that brought tears to Sarah's eyes, Luna rubbed her head against Ranger's neck. A greeting reserved for accepted companions. Within an hour, they were lying side by side in the sun. 3 years after that fateful morning when Ranger was 72 hours from euthanasia, Sarah stood watching him groom Luna in their shared enclosure. Dr. Patterson stood beside her, documenting their behavior for a paper on social rehabilitation in solitary felids. "You know what strikes me most?" Emily said, lowering her camera. "It's not just that you saved his life. It's that you gave him a life worth living." Sarah nodded, thinking of all the animals she couldn't save, the ones whose 72 hours ran out before someone stepped forward. But then Ranger looked up, meeting her eyes with that steady amber gaze, and she saw not the terrified, neglected animal from the quarantine pen, but a survivor who had found his place in the world. That evening, as Sarah completed her rounds, she stopped by Ranger and Luna's enclosure one last time. They were curled together in their den box, barely visible in the fading light. Ranger's eyes opened briefly, watching her with calm recognition before closing again. No fear, no tension, just the quiet acknowledgement of a familiar presence. Sarah thought about the phone call she'd received that morning. Another facility closed, more animals needing placement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new desperate situations requiring impossible solutions. But tonight, watching Ranger and Luna rest peacefully in their sanctuary, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Every life mattered. Every 72 hours was a lifetime to the animal counting down. And sometimes, when someone was willing to show up, to say yes when everyone else said no, those hours could stretch into years of dignity, companionship, and peace. As she drove home under the star-filled Arizona sky, Sarah made a mental note to call the facility tomorrow to ask about the animals needing placement. Because that's what people like her did. They showed up. Even when the odds were impossible, even when resources were stretched thin, even when everyone else had already said no. They showed up, and sometimes that made all the difference.